So good morning, everybody. Welcome to week 3 of the Story of Now. Week 4, the Story of Now. This week, we're going to be talking about why history helps us understand the present. We have 4 wonderful speakers, and I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves, as always, and to explain a little bit about their academic disciplines and their own academic specialties.
Great, I will go first. My name is Dr. Kate DeConinck. I teach in the Department of Theology and Religious Studies at the University of San Diego. More specifically, I'm trained in the history and the anthropology of religion. What that means is I look at historical documents and archives, and I combine that with ethnographic fieldwork. So I go out and I talk to people who live out religion in their lives and try and learn more about what it means to them. As you'll hear in my presentation today, I am very much focused as my subspecialty on religion in the wake of mass tragedies or kind of big catastrophic events. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about some of those interests, but I've done research about the aftermath of 9/11 in New York City, the aftermath of the Sandy Hook shootings in Connecticut and other big events, and trying to figure out the role that religion plays in helping communities and individuals move forward from those sorts of events. So it's a pleasure to be here with all of you today, and I will turn it over to Dr. Asaro.
Thank you, Kate. My name is Brittany Asaro, and I'm in the Italian program in the same department as Dr. Peterson, which is Languages, Cultures, and Literatures. I am an early modernist, which means I look at literature from about 1300 all the way to about 1700. And what I do and what people in my field do is we look at old texts, which you could consider to be literary artifacts. I like to think of myself that way, as kind of, trying to delve into the metaphorical dirt and make some discoveries. And so we consider these texts not only as artistic expressions of individual people, but also as kind of symbolic markers of a specific moment in time. And I will be doing something a bit differently than I usually do today. That is, I'll be inviting you to consider what these old texts mean for your personal lives. But I think there's some room for adventure considering the type of class that this is.
Thanks, Brittany. Hi, everyone. My name is Derrick Cartwright, and I'm an art historian. I teach in the Department of Art, Architecture, and Art History, and I also am the director of the 6 galleries that are scattered throughout the USD campus. And so I hope you'll all come and visit them at some point, and not just when your parents are in town. I think it's important to take full advantage of what USD offers. So I'm trained as an American art historian. I work on the art history of North America. And basically that means I look at the period from the 17th century to the present, some very well-known images, as well as, in my case, I'm also interested in ephemeral work and work that may not be part of the canon of art history. And so when I teach, I think I'm trying to equip my students with tools that they can use in their daily lives to think critically about the images that are coming at you. And I think from the moment we wake up in the morning, we're barraged with all sorts of images. Some are persuasive, some are less persuasive, but I think the ability to think critically about those images and to put them in a context is something that goes way beyond just the discipline of art history. And so I'll share some current research that I'm doing right now with you today, and can't wait to meet you all when you come to campus. Thanks.
My name is Dr. Hamilton-Bleakley. I'm a philosopher. I teach in the philosophy department, but I'm actually trained in what's called intellectual history. So I got my PhD at the University of Cambridge in England, and there's a very particular way of doing philosophy there, which is very historical. So there's kind of 2 different kinds of philosophy. There's analytical philosophy, or there's historical approach. And so I'm trained in the historical approach. And I just love looking at past texts to see how they can speak to us, the way people thought, the things that were concerning them. And that's really what the history of philosophy is about. Personally, I work in medieval and early modern philosophy. So I'm interested in specifically what's called philosophy of liberalism, which is the philosophy that tries to figure out where the idea of human rights comes from. Sometimes philosophers don't actually know if there is such a thing as human rights. So I think there are. And so I look at kind of how ideas about human rights got started, which is arguably starts in the kind of medieval to early modern period. So that's kind of personal focus. But I also do, so political philosophy is my first love, but as a philosopher, you have to be very wide ranging. So I teach other things too. I teach ethics. I teach philosophy of God. So philosophy of religion. And the wonderful thing about philosophy is whatever you're interested in, philosophy has something to say about it in some way. So there's a wide range of topics that philosophers cover. But I'm really excited to be here, excited to talk about how past understandings of political institutions how they can speak to us today in some way.
With that, we'll let Dr. DeConinck get us started.
So my talk for today is focused on this theme of museums and memorialization, which I could talk to you for about 40 days about, but I'm going to try and keep it within about 20 minutes and then have ample time for Q&A, both with our group and during my discussion sections this week. So I mentioned to you just a couple of minutes ago that, in addition to being based in religious studies, part of my interest is in the aftermath of these big kind of collective tragedies or events like 9/11, right? And what I want to think about with you today is the role that museums and this process of creating museums or memorials, what that can do for us as a society when we're trying to make sense out of events that have been traumatic or difficult or have pushed us to the limits in different ways, not only individually, but collectively as a society. So there are kind of two main questions that I want us to think about as I'm going through the material for today that kind of guided my preparation of these slides. The first question is thinking about how do rituals and acts of memorialization potentially help us move forward in the immediate aftermath of a societal disruption, whether it's something huge, like a massive terrorist attack, or something that maybe affects even just a smaller community. Okay. And then my second question is for us to think through more in relation to this week's theme later on in time, as we start to think about the rituals or the activities or the sites that we've maybe built or created to help us work through something. How do these sites and these rituals either help or hinder or otherwise frame our ability to quote unquote know the tragedies of the past, right? So when we go to a museum, is this helpful as we try and understand what has happened to past societies or to our own society, in recent years? So these are some of the guiding questions I want us to think through. Okay. All right, so let's go from here. All right, so a couple of weeks ago, Dr. Crawford shared some really great info with you that I thought was fascinating, right, about the sorts of people and institutions and political parties and others that Americans trust, right? And I wanted to circle back to that through the lens of thinking about museums and the act of creating museums as well. So here is some data that comes from a 2018 survey that surveyed thousands of Americans across the United States to try and get a sense of who do they trust, what sorts of institutions matter to them, so on and so forth. And just a few things that I picked out that are relevant for today's presentation. The first is that Americans view museums as credible sources of information, right? They believe the information that is presented to them in the exhibits and the exhibitions, right, that they see in different museums across our country, okay? Furthermore, they also trust museums more than they trust newspapers and more than they trust their federal and state agencies, right? So this means that there's a tremendous amount of trust that people are putting into the narratives that are shared with them at museums, right? They don't go in and expect that a museum is going to be biased or that it's going to contain misinformation, right? And then lastly, to kind of build off of what Dr. Crawford was talking about also, most people do not view museums as having a political agenda. So from all sorts of sides of the political spectrum, museums are still seen as trustworthy in our society. And this is data from 2018. We've had a lot of political contention both prior to that point and after, and this still maintains a truth in terms of what people are thinking and feeling about museums. So just to build off that a little bit, my particular interest is in a specific type of museum, which is a memorial museum, Okay, so this is data that's about all sorts of different museums, but what I'm most interested in are the museums that try and tell the history and the stories of particular traumatic or disruptive events, right? So just to explain, what is a memorial museum a little bit, there's a great author, Amy Asaro, whose work I really like. She came out with a book a couple years ago called Exhibiting Atrocity, which you could check out if you're interested in it. But she says that memorial museums aspire to be houses of history where the past is uncovered, documented, and preserved, and the truth about what happened is revealed to visitors. So the first role that memorial museums play, just like many other museums, right, is that they try and preserve the past and they try and provide narratives or stories to help people understand this history, right? Beyond that, though, memorial museums are a little bit different from other types of museums in the sense that they often also try and fill the space of being a space of remembrance and sometimes even healing for communities that have suffered a loss, right? So this could mean acknowledging, the victims who were killed in a particular event. It could mean providing a space for mourning, for people to come together and gather, right? But there's something that's a little bit different about that compared to going to maybe other sorts of museums you might have visited in your own lives as well, right? And lastly, the other thing that I would say is that many memorial museums also, as you're kind of exiting the museum, usually they try and offer some sort of warning to us today, right, about lessons that we can learn from the past to try and avoid what has previously kind of destroyed or decimated, people at a given point in time. So there's often this ethic of never again or never forget, right? And a kind of call to action that you might see at memorial museums that might just be framed a little bit differently from what you might see in other sorts of museums. Okay, so these are the sites that I spend a lot of time at. I'm a really fun travel companion because if you go on a road trip with me, I'm going to drag you to all these random memorial museums across the country, right? Anyways, let's go from here. Okay, so moving on from that. Another thing that's important as context here is to realize that we have actually had an explosion, a huge preponderance of memorials and memorial museums that have been built in the United States over the past 3 decades in particular. There's this author, Erica Doss, whose work I really appreciate. She wrote this book called Memorial Mania. Based on the title, you can probably guess what it's about, but it's really about this kind of growing obsession that we seem to be seeing in our culture about building memorials and building museums to kind of mark memories of different events and different historical time periods. So this is just one quote from her book where she says, "Why do we make memorials in America today? And why do we make so many of them? Just in the past few decades, thousands of new memorials have materialized in the American landscape. What is driving this contemporary American frenzy to memorialize, and who is being remembered?" Okay, so these are actually very similar to some of the questions that I ask in my own research and my own classes that I teach and so forth. Doss has her own ways of answering this question. And for our purpose today, what I wanted to do was introduce 2 ideas from my own research and my own field that I found very interesting and helpful in answering these sorts of questions. Why are we making so many memorials? What are they doing for us, memorial museums in particular? And what is driving this sort of behavior in our culture? Okay. So 2 concepts, good things to put in your notes if you're taking notes. All right, so the first is this idea that's called agency, okay? And agency, I would describe, other people might describe it in other ways, but I would describe it as having the sense that your actions and experiences matter, that you are not just some object of fate that is constantly being acted upon, right? But you are actually an agent, an actor who has some degree or some sense of power in your life. Right? And you can imagine that in the wake of some sort of big collective tragedy, a lot of people might feel like their sense of agency has been threatened, right? They might feel like they were powerless in a given situation if they were seeing people being killed or they were, experiencing things in their own life that they felt like they were helpless to stop, right? So in that case, they might feel like their sense of agency is under threat. I think that a lot of the time, though, this is just an everyday reality that we're constantly navigating, even outside of extreme situations, though, right? So the example that I give sometimes when I teach this in class is I say, think about if you've had a really bad day, right? So, you go to school, you got a lower grade on that quiz than you were hoping to get. You're feeling kind of bummed about that. You get into an argument with your best friend and it's like, oh man, this day, it's dragging me down, right? So you go home or you go back to your dorm or whatever, and what do? We're all going to do different things, right, to try and cope with what we've been through that day. If it's me, I'm probably going to clean my dorm room. That's like the type of personality that I am, right? And what I like about that, and what I think gives me maybe a better sense of agency in that situation, is I take the chaos of my dorm room and I manipulate it so it's clean and it's, tidy, and it makes me feel better, right? And it doesn't change the fact that I've had a really awful day, but it does make me feel like I've restored a sense of power or a sense of order in my life, right? So that's like a very low stakes sort of scenario that maybe resonates for some of you, and others might have other ways of, expressing agency under those circumstances. Okay. So hold on to that idea. Think about agency a little bit. And the other idea that I wanted to introduce is this idea of intersubjectivity, which is a big fancy word, but we're going to break it down. The way that I would talk about it is that, especially in American culture, we tend to think of ourselves sometimes strictly as just independent subjects, right? Like, I am me, I am totally separate from everything else that's around me in the world. I make my own decisions, I choose my own actions in life. I am an individual subject, right? And sometimes that's true. I do have a lot of power in kind of dictating how my life goes, but I'm also enmeshed in relationships that do affect me and that affect kind of webs of things around me as well, right? So I would describe intersubjectivity as thinking about the webs of relationship that connect us with all sorts of different things in the world around us, whether it's people or places or landscapes, animals or pets, right? They can be part of our intersubjective relationships too, even ideas, right? We don't exist in a vacuum. One of the things that I realized in interviewing people in the wake of different traumatic events is that a lot of people feel really isolated after something traumatic has happened to them, right? So when I was doing field work in New York, a lot of people just saying like, I feel like no one else, I can't connect with anyone else, right? I feel so alone, like no one can understand what I've been through, right? So one of the things that we might see as we're starting to think through some of the examples that I want to share is that oftentimes after these collective events, there's a need to restore this sense of relationship that might feel kind of under threat, right? Because of what a person or a group has gone through. Okay. So those are the two big ideas we're going to think about. I've introduced a couple questions, and what I want to do for the rest of my presentation time is just give you a few examples of the sorts of cases and books and things that I'm thinking about and reading about to kind of bring this to life and start to think about some specifics. We've done all the abstract stuff, and now let's talk about some specific examples, okay? So I want to start by actually talking about an event that probably most of you who are students weren't even alive for, right? There was, in 1995, an event that was known as the Oklahoma City bombing. And I barely remember it myself, but there's this beautiful memorial museum that exists in Oklahoma City today that kind of is meant to mark the site of what happened here. So just to give you a tiny bit of context without telling the whole story, because there are many books that you could read about this. What happened in Oklahoma City was on April 19th, 1995. There was an ex-Army soldier and a security guard named Timothy McVeigh, who basically parked a rented truck in front of this federal building in downtown Oklahoma City. He left the van there, and the van itself was filled with this huge bomb that exploded right at 9 a.m. So basically 9:02 a.m. So the whole building had been filled up with people who were preparing for the workday. It was a very kind of commercial part of the city. So there were a lot of buildings that were surrounding that area as well. And when the bomb exploded, it destroyed about a third of that federal building. And it also destroyed about 300 nearby buildings. So it was a huge catastrophic event, right? There were also all sorts of cars in the surrounding area that caught fire or that were incinerated. So it basically, ended up looking like a war zone right in the middle of Oklahoma City. By the time that the dust had been settled and that the site had been excavated and kind of cleared, there were 168 people who had been killed, including 19 children. And then there were several hundred people more who had been injured as well. So at this point in time, this is actually the worst act of domestic terrorism that the United States had seen, at this point in history. So with that context in mind, what you're looking at on this slide is an image of the Memorial Museum site as it looks today. And there's all sorts of different parts we could talk about here, but I'll just give you a little basic lay of the land for you to think about as we think about the creation of this Memorial Museum. On the right part of the slide, kind of right underneath the text here, you can see the museum space itself. So if you were to go in there, you would see these big exhibit halls that tell the story of what happened, how people responded, kind of a message about some of the dangerous ideologies that McVeigh and others held that led to this kind of attack. You have a huge reflecting pool in the middle here. That's supposed to be the space where people can kind of have a quiet moment. There's all sorts of things I could say about that, but I'll try and keep it simple for now. And then on the left side of the screen, you see what are actually a series of empty chairs that are lit up at night. Each chair is meant to represent one person who was killed in the attack. So there's 168 of them in total. And then lastly, this tree over here, back on the right-hand side, is called the survivor tree. And it was a tree that existed on the site before the big explosion, before the bombing. And it survived, the blast, and it was kept as a kind of symbol of hope on the site once it was kind of reconstructed. Okay. So that was longer than I meant to talk about this, but I wanted to give you some details. But let me talk to you a little bit about the creation of this site, right? Which is really what I'm most interested in. It's cool to look at a memorial museum, but it's even cooler to think about how did we end up with this and who is involved and what was at stake in that negotiation, right? So there's an author whose work I really appreciate. His name is Edward Linenthal. I'm going to cite him again later because I like his work so much. But he wrote a book called The Unfinished Bombing. And it was all about the creation of this one memorial museum in Oklahoma City. And if you were to read his book, he talks about how the planning of this one site involved more than 300 people, right? And so it included, family members of people who had been killed. It included survivors. It included local residents. And that was intentional because those who were involved in the planning really wanted to give many different stakeholders a say in how this site was kind of produced and the narratives that were told there. They wanted it to be therapeutic for everybody in the community, right? So a lot of cooks in the kitchen, so to speak. And because of that, they had a lot of tough decisions that they had to negotiate, as a group over time. So you can see the kind of steps in the process that I laid out for you here, just very basically. Each one was very complicated in and of itself, but they created a task force of people who were going to kind of lead the efforts. They held public meetings to hear what people from the local community and family members and others, what they were hoping to see created out of the site. They created a mission statement that was going to kind of guide their work moving forward. They had a huge, international design competition, and then they selected a design and actually built it, right? And it was actually, it opened in the year 2000, so just 5 years after the attacks, which is actually pretty fast, as we'll see with some of the other examples that I'll share. But some of the different things that they had to navigate as they were deciding which design they were going to select. Let me just go back to the image for a second here. To give you one example, if you see the reflecting pool in the middle of the site here, if you were to look beyond it, there's actually a major street, 5th Street, that kind of would have run through this area. And so one of the questions, it used to run through that area, one of the questions that the design team and the planners had to negotiate was, should we actually create this kind of block in the middle of a major avenue, right? So that we can build the museum on the site. Or is that going to be too disruptive to the rest of the city, right? If we use the architecture in that way, right? So do we shut down this major kind of thoroughfare in order to do this? There were also questions about, should the unclaimed remains of people whose, bodies had been recovered at this site, should they be interned at the Memorial Museum, or should they be kind of, buried or placed elsewhere in the city if their family members hadn't claimed them? So there were many, many kind of heated debates about what to do with some of these questions that cropped up. And there's many other examples I could give there. But as Linenthal puts it in this quote at the bottom, he says, many people involved in the memorial process spoke of the journey that they took together, about the evolution of so many individuals into a working bereaved community. So what this makes me think about a lot is that idea of intersubjectivity, right? It would have been much easier probably just to pick, say, 15 people and say, okay, you guys, you get free reign. You plan the whole thing, you do the whole Memorial Museum planning. But because this community wanted to restore that sense of community, right, they decided to work together through all of these questions. So that many people could have a sense of voice and a sense of agency in the planning process. Okay. So that's one example we can think about. Another example I wanted to share is a site that some of you might have visited yourselves. I know a lot of school trips will sometimes go and visit it, the US Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, DC. If you haven't been, hopefully you'll get an opportunity to go at some point, but this is what the exterior of that building looks like. This memorial museum opened in 1993, and as you might imagine, it is kind of dedicated to preserving the story and to promote remembrance of the millions of people who were killed under Nazi rule during World War II, including 6 million Jews. So many different stories told at this one site as well. All right, so to go from there, back to our friend Edward Linenthal. He wrote another book about this site. And what I think is so interesting here is that this is a site that took 15 years to negotiate, plan, and build. So if you think about Oklahoma City, that took 5 years. That already maybe feels like a long period of time to some of you. This took 3 times that amount of time, right? And part of this was because, again, there were so many different stakeholders who were involved in the planning of not only, what the space was going to look like, but also the exhibit halls and how they were going to tell the story of the Holocaust, right? So again, all sorts of questions that they had to navigate, right? First of all, this was an atrocity. This is a genocide that occurred not on US soil. So there was a question of what is an appropriate place to put a national kind of museum, given that it didn't happen in our nation, right, on the context of US soil, right? So there were questions about, should this memorial museum be located in Washington, DC? If so, should it be at, on the National Mall? Was that an appropriate part, to connect to these other American narratives that are shared within the context of the National Mall? So, they had to settle that kind of early on. There was also this concern, some of you might not know this, but during World War II, it's not just Nazis and people in Europe who are expressing deeply rooted forms of anti-Semitism, right? This was also really prevalent in US culture. And it remains that even today, there's a lot of undercurrents and sometimes overt expressions of anti-Semitism in the US today. So one of the questions that the planners were actively thinking about is, how do we get Americans to care about this genocide, right? How do we humanize this issue or this genocide in an appropriate way? And this included questions about, who gets wall space, who has their name listed on the memorial, where do we draw the line of inclusion and exclusion there? Should we include human hair? That was one idea that someone had as a way of humanizing things, to have this one section that would just be filled with hair that had been collected from one of the concentration camps where people would have been shaved kind of entering the camp. They decided not to. They felt like that was too personal for reasons I can talk more about later. But, in the end, there's this huge site that is produced. And as Linenthal reminds us, it's still a contested site, right? Even after it's finished, right? So the permanent exhibition, as he says, stands as an authoritative public narrative, but not an uncontested one. So just to give one example of what he means there, the Romani are a group that also were kind of persecuted and suffered under Nazi rule, during this period of World War II. They felt as though, many of their leaders felt as though their narrative was not fully recognized in the way that the museum told the story, right? So even once the museum was settled, there's still debate about it, right? Okay, and I think I'm just going to go through the next couple slides quick because I know I'm nearing the end of my time. But just to give you a little bit of a sense of the sorts of stuff I've worked on, I mentioned I've done field work about the aftermath of 9/11 in New York City. There are many sites of 9/11 remembrance in New York City, specifically in Lower Manhattan today. Probably the most well-known is the National 9/11 Memorial Museum, which you see pictured on the slide here. What you see here is actually the Memorial Plaza. So again, many of you probably wouldn't remember this depending when you were born, but there used to be the Twin Towers in New York City that would have existed on this site. Today, there are 2 reflecting pools that stand in the footprints of where those buildings used to be. There's this beautiful memorial plaza that surrounds that. And then there's the entrance to a museum, which actually goes down below underground and extends kind of throughout this, almost this whole block almost. It's a massive museum that has tremendous, huge artifacts and different stories about what happened on 9/11 and different people who were involved in the rescue and recovery efforts as well. So in terms of my own research, kind of bringing together my interest in religion, in sites of memory, in kind of anthropological field work, these are the sorts of questions that I ask, thinking about, how is the story of 9/11 actually told at sites like this, right? What is the framing? Where do you start the story? Where do you end it, right? Whose stories or experiences are foregrounded and whose are either ignored or kind of pushed into the background more, right? And, as someone who's interested in religious studies, I'm also thinking about how do sites like this inform public conversations or ideas about religion and or about certain religious groups. So I can tell you more about this in the Q&A, but one of the things I was really interested in was, in the case of 9/11, the terrorists who carried out the attacks called themselves Muslims. Many people who are Muslim today say that has nothing to do with my faith. Right? So how does the museum what labels do they use, right? How do they frame Islam in the context of this attack, right? These are important questions that continue to shape not only how people think about 9/11, but how they think about their Muslim American neighbors, right? So there's a lot at stake in the stories that are told here. So my last set of questions that I would encourage you to think through, and I would love to talk about this more in my discussion group as well, this is based off the article that I had assigned for today, is thinking about the moment that we're presently living in. We are still in the midst of a pandemic. We may or may not be emerging from it at any point soon in time. But eventually there will come a time where we have to decide how we want to tell the story of the coronavirus, right? And some of the questions that I would want to think through are things like, how might we memorialize in a way that cultivates healing for many people in our society, right? That is an inclusive form of healing, and or do justice to the many forms of loss that people have experienced over the past year and a half, right? Additionally, how do we want future generations to look back at or know the moment that we're living in? Like your kids or their kids, what would you want them to know about what you're experiencing today, right? And then lastly, back to my religious studies background, how will the story of religion be told or not told in our framings of that event? So yeah, I'm so excited to hear what our other presenters have to say today as well. Thank you all for listening, and I look forward to our conversation.
So hi, everyone. I'm going to actually start today by asking you to think of the last time you had a really good idea. This can be a realization, it can be a solution to a problem, it can be a stroke of genius, or an idea for something creative. And I invite you to focus not on the idea itself, but on the moment when it came to you. So now I'm going to ask you, where were you and what were you doing? Were you inside or were you outside? Were you sitting or were you standing? Were you listening to someone or something, or was there just silence? Were you alone or were you with others? Did you see something that gave you the idea, or did it just come to you when you weren't looking at anything in particular? Some of you may have gotten this idea in the classroom, but some of you may not. And I can tell you that my best ideas have come to me when I'm driving, when I'm washing the dishes, and when I'm brushing my teeth. So basically, when I'm doing something mundane, something that seems to be the opposite of creativity and scholarship, but this is where the real thinking happens. So what you see here is where Leonardo da Vinci got most of his good ideas. So where are we here? Let me explain. Most of you may know Leonardo da Vinci as a painter. And some of you, well, I would imagine all of you know the famous work, the Mona Lisa. It's one of the most iconic works of visual arts in the world. Some of you may have known that Da Vinci was a skilled engineer. In his notebooks, we find blueprints of flying machines, double-decker bridges, and even a military tank. He was an architect, a city planner, an anatomist, a mathematician, a writer, a sculptor, a sketch artist, and of course, a painter. He seemed to excel at anything he attempted. He was a polymath, coming from the Greek word polymathos, which means having learned much. But the funny thing about this aspect of Leonardo's legacy is that he also had no formal education. His parents were not married when he was born, and they both married different people after his birth. His father was a lawyer and his mother was a peasant. Da Vinci really isn't Leonardo's last name. It means from Vinci. Since Leonardo was considered illegitimate, he did not take his father's last name. Instead, he was identified by the place where he was born, a little village in the hills of Tuscany in central Italy, not far from the famous city of Florence. So this that you see here was Leonardo's classroom. Had he been born in wedlock, he would have been sent away to school at an early age and then eventually to law school to follow in his father's profession. Instead, he spent his childhood doing basically whatever he wanted, and he decided to roam these hills, observing nature. At a young age, he developed a passionate interest in all of nature's wonders, as well as a very keen skill of observation. We don't all have the opportunity to wander around the Tuscan countryside to get good ideas, although that can happen if you're interested in studying abroad and, depending on the state of the world. So please do come and seek me out and ask me about that. But luckily, when it comes to places of contemplation, you guys have a pretty good alternative, which I will show you here. We're very fortunate. So this brings us to our first lesson from Leonardo da Vinci, and I'm going to call it Leo Lesson 1. In order to learn, you need time to think. These next years may be the only time in your life where your main job is just to think. So find some time to let your mind wander. Unplug. Walk between classes without checking your phone. Walk back to your dorm or drive back to your house without listening to music. Do mundane tasks without entertaining yourself. Try riding the bus or waiting in line and doing nothing. Notice the world around you. Let your brain juices stew and see what ideas come to you. You are all going to be more fortunate than Leonardo in that you're going to receive a formal education. Book learning, as he called it, is a wonderful thing. What you learn in your classes from your professors is going to serve you for the rest of your lives, but it is not the full story of learning. Do your assignments, but then find time to look up from your books to participate meaningfully in the world around you. Leonardo tells us that experience is the source for anything true that was ever written. And this, I'm going to say, is Leo lesson number 2. There's another important step, however, I would say, in gaining knowledge. Thinking is important and letting life inspire you is important, but eventually you're going to need to organize your good ideas into something others can understand. You're going to need to write it down. Leonardo recorded his ideas in notebooks, about 13,000 pages over the course of his life. These are incredible artifacts, and with some notable exceptions, like Bill Gates, who owns one of them, they are kept in various museums around the world. One advantage to living in the digital age, however, is that anyone with an internet connection can browse Leonardo's notebooks virtually, and I highly recommend you're checking it out. This is an example of some typical pages, although these are quite orderly for Leonardo. The notebooks are basically a visual representation of the workings of his mind. I'll give you a much less impressive example. These are my own notebooks, which I add to pretty much daily. So this brings me to Leo lesson number 3, which is to keep a notebook. If you write your ideas down as they come to you, you're going to end up with an invaluable treasure. Another reason why keeping a notebook is important is because it helps you see the connections in life. Leonardo saw connections everywhere. He believed that a good painter did not only study painting. If someone wanted to paint hair, for example, they should also understand something about the movement of water. If someone wanted to add flowers in the foreground, they should also know botany. You can see Leonardo's expertise in anatomy is reflected in the musculature of his horses, and of course, in the enigmatic smiles for which he is famous. So here is lesson number 4. Making connections is arguably one of the best skills that USD offers you. You're going to hear a lot about integration and interdisciplinary learning when classes start in the fall, if you have not already. A liberal arts education, what you have all signed up for, is basically this: learning how to spot connections. This is the good stuff in life. This is exactly what we're doing here. Myself and the other 3 professors speaking today all specialize in different fields, but we can be in dialogue with one another because there are points at which all of our fields intersect. And this type of conversation is the richest form of knowledge. Of course, there are pitfalls with seeing connections everywhere. Leonardo was a notorious procrastinator, and he would often abandon projects when he was inspired by a new one. If your eyes are open to how everything connects, then it's easy to follow rabbit holes and not get a lot done. Speaking of which, I'm going to share with you now some stats about Leonardo's unfinished work, or finished work, or perhaps unfinished work. I'll let you decide. And this is over the course of his 67-year lifespan, which is a pretty decent length considering his time period. So here's the numbers. Numerous sketch plans for sculptures, actual statues, 0. His architectural blueprints were also numerous, but we have absolutely no buildings that are attributed to him. The total completed paintings in his entire life, 67 years, okay, we'll chop off what, 10, 15 for his infancy. It's 15 total. And this is coming from his notebooks. So this brings us to Leo lesson number 5. Sometimes the best path is not necessarily the most productive path. You'll find, and you may have figured this out already, that our society favors production. Success is almost always measured by results. And since you live in this world, you're going to have to deal with this. However, I think it's also important to be aware that production and knowledge are not the same thing. You can produce much with little knowledge, and you can gain great knowledge at times with little production to show for it. One reason for this is that you have to take risks to gain knowledge, and risks are inherently risky. Leonardo was bold about taking risks, intent on doing anything it took to pursue knowledge. This was not always popular. His dissections of cadavers, for example, to discover the inner workings of the human body was frowned upon. And some of his experiments were not entirely successful. You may recognize one of Leonardo's most famous failures, which I will show you now. This is the Last Supper, commissioned by a church in Milano. The friars paid Leonardo a great sum of money to paint a picture of Jesus's last meal on the wall of the refectory or cafeteria. Leonardo did not seem concerned about guaranteeing customer satisfaction when he decided to try a new technique to apply the paint to the wall. Mind you, the standard technique, the fresco, had been used successfully in Italy since about 2,000 years before Leonardo's time. The experiment was a failure, and the painting began crumbling in Leonardo's lifetime. However, even today, over 1,000 people from all over the world come to visit this painting to marvel at its beauty. 1,000 each day. You have to make reservations. So here's Leo lesson number 6. Take some chances. Perhaps you're saying, did I not Leonardo da Vinci? Well, no, no one's quite like Leonardo. He really was an exceptional individual. But what you may not know about him is that he didn't necessarily fit the mold in his time. We have already seen that he was considered illegitimate by birth and how he was dismissed by some for being uneducated. He was also an introvert. He seemed to have probably liked animals more than he liked people. He was queer. He may have been gay or he may have been asexual. There's no record of him ever having a sexual or romantic relationship with anyone in his relatively long life. But all of these intersecting identities are what made him special. And in fact, by the end of his life, after holding dozens of different jobs, he finally got his dream job. The King of France invited him to come to his court and do nothing but just to be there. The king noticed that Leonardo was special and that just his presence would elevate his court. So Leo lesson number 7, at least how I interpret it, is that not fitting the mold is a good thing. So we've now arrived at our final lesson from Leo, what I call the ultimate Leo lesson. And before I tell you what it is, I wanted to share with you a few more extraordinary things about Leonardo da Vinci. I told you that he loved animals. He was a vegetarian at a time and in a culture when vegetarianism was relatively unheard of. He would actually buy live birds and fish at the markets and set them free in the wild. And even though he preferred his own company over the company of people, he was also a pacifist who cared about people. This was very difficult considering that Leonardo was an engineer working for powerful politicians, and Italy was at war for nearly his entire lifetime. In fact, we see in his notebooks that he developed a snorkel apparatus, but that he hid the plans from his boss, who was an important military commander, because he realized it could be used by soldiers to infiltrate cities and harm people. So here's the key to life, true knowledge. Hopefully you're ready. Let me see if I can find it. The ultimate Leo lesson is true knowledge in all its forms leads to love. This can be love for your creator, whoever and whatever that means to you. It can mean love for your planet, love for your fellow human creatures, love for yourself, mind, body, and soul. This is not my idea, and it's not only Leonardo's. Some form of this shows up in virtually all world religions and spiritual philosophies, and it's for a good reason. Regardless of your culture or your religion, whether you're religious or not, this applies to you as a human being. And this word of love, how it also appears in Leonardo, does not mean sitting idly by, watching the world and generally feeling positive towards others. Love takes work. We can also understand it as care. True knowledge will inspire you to take actions into caring for the planet and its creatures, for example, to take action in caring for people, to advocate for the vulnerable, to take care of ourselves, cultivating not just our mind, as Leonardo did, but also, as he did, our bodies and our spirits. Sometimes this is hard, and often it is messy, and it may even be risky. But I would argue that nothing else in life really matters. This is true knowledge, the ultimate end goal of your education. I'm going to leave you now with the words of Leonardo, who I think puts it better. The love of anything is the offspring of knowledge. And I'll conclude there. Thank you.
Thank you. That was so powerful and really appreciate it. Thank you so much. I realize it's actually hard to follow Kate and Brittany. I'm glad I follow them because in a way they prepared us nicely for what I want to talk about. When you think about it, not every work of art ends up in a museum. And in the case of Leonardo in his lifetime, Michelangelo too, they were recognized as people of great talent, and their works were admired, as Brittany told us, by the King of France. And they had opportunities that not everyone is given. And so we talk about those artists as being part of a canon. And I guess today I want to share with you actually a lot of images, but some that I'm guessing are going to be unfamiliar to you and that are not part of a canon, but nonetheless are making their way towards museums and towards greater recognition. So I'm showing you two works in this title slide that I find really compelling and that I think have had a large purchase on the imagination, but I would defy almost anyone to tell me the name of the photographers who took them. Perkle Jones on the left, and Ernest Withers, I think, on the right. But I'm guessing that a lot of these works may not have reached you. I may be the actual only person on this Zoom call who has some sort of living memory of the moment in which these works were created. And that dates me pretty specifically, it seems to me. But I want to think with you about why some images captivate us and why others tend to not be like Leonardo, but left to the side. And I'm guessing if I told you we're going to talk about images of social activists, political leaders, people who were change makers in the 1960s, many of you could conjure an image of Martin Luther King Jr. as the one I'm showing you on the left or on the right. Maybe a few of you could bring to mind a really compelling image like Gordon Parks's portrait of Malcolm X. But those images have been brought into a canon and celebrated by not just art historians, but by political theorists and by historians for a long time. And so my guess is when you were in grade school even, you were being shown pictures of these men and some women who actually were integrated into histories in ways that we're now very comfortable with. But I think when you even look at, for instance, Stephen Summerstein's image of Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. Addressing a crowd in Montgomery, Alabama, which he did at the end of a march between Selma and Montgomery, arguing for the voting rights of African Americans. There's something even in his face where he's pulled back a little bit and maybe a little weary from the march that doesn't always get interpreted. And so I guess one of the things I want to practice with you today is how to interpret images and how to make them richer for us. And also, as I think I said in my intro, to begin to make distinctions between works that are compelling and that last and other images such as the ones on our cell phones that are purely ephemeral and which we probably need not to take as seriously. So art historians tend to think about images as material things. So in the way that Brittany showed you those notebooks, with the exception of the one that lives in Seattle, they're available for scholars to hold in their hands and to touch and ponder. But we ask the same kinds of questions of those things, and it leads to some interesting answers. One of the things that you might ask of an image like the one I'm showing you on the left is, who did it? When was it made? What is it? Where is it today? And why was it created? And how should we interpret it? So I think some of this is really factual, and you can, I don't think you should, but you could look it up on Wikipedia and you could get an answer to some of these questions. And Wikipedia is notoriously unreliable, I would warn you. And so therefore probably ought not to be trusted, but you could actually get your answers at the National Gallery of Art's website where this work lives. It's a work by an artist who I admire a lot. His name is Glenn Ligon, and it's a painting, actually, a large painting about 40 by 25 inches. And it seems to me, for a work that was done in 1988, it's a little bit worse for the wear and tear, maybe even worse than some of the images in terms of its condition than those Leonardo drawings, which Brittany just showed us. So maybe some of that is deliberate on the part of Ligon. But if you've been to the National Gallery of Art, you can stand in front of this work and think about its meanings and think about the person who created it and why he created it. And I guess I'm willing to say that Ligon has reached a place in his career where he is accepted by everyone as belonging, after all, to the National Gallery of Art, which is an institution that never de-accessions, never gets rid of anything, right? So if you've made it there, you are permanently placed in a canon of national significance, at least for the art historical world. But you may not know, unless you've been going through a lot of images from the 1960s, where Ligon's untitled work gets its authority or where it gets its meaning. And you'd have to know images like Ernest Wither's photograph of a sanitation workers' strike in Memphis, Tennessee of 1968 to know just how deliberately and specifically, almost to the size of the object itself, Ligon is quoting this kind of representation and why he wants to bring it back in 1988 as a source of thought and inquiry is important to think about. It sort of connects Withers's image of this social protest to the present moment in a way that I find really powerful. And knowing Ligon's work makes me think that he's somebody who's so smart about the connections he wants us to make between images in the visual world. It's a quotation, a citation with a force to it that demands us to sort of be held accountable. I'm interested in Ligon. As I've said, you can come see one of his works at the university galleries. We have a large print collection, and since I've been at USD and since 2012, been trying to diversify the collection. And so we've been working to acquire work like the one I'm showing you by Ligon called Detail 2014, which is actually hard to decipher. It's in difference to the clarity of the image on the left. The image on the right is the superimposition of words. It's the testimony of 5 young African-American men who were falsely accused of a crime, and it's their legal testimony just printed over and over and over again on a page. And if you hold it at certain angles, you can actually, through the silkscreen blur, see some of the text emerging. And that's, I think, again, one of Ligon's great moves as an artist, to make things that appear to be hard to read visible under certain conditions. I'm giving you this as background because I want us now to think about a group of images, some of which you may or may not have seen. This is a photograph taken by Blair Stapp, and it was used by a group that formed in Oakland in 1966, and which really had a very vital political presence, especially in California, until the early 1980s. It's a photograph of Huey Newton, who was the Minister of Defense for this group called the Black Panthers. And it's an image that existed in a kind of cheap newsprint format, but today, as I'm showing you in this slide, belongs to the permanent collection of the Smithsonian at the National Museum of African American History and Culture. And so it's a work that has stood the test of time and that is making its way into the canon. I think it's an arresting image, at least for me. When I stand in front of it, I think about how Newton posed himself for this photographer and how it then got used in an almost propaganda machine to put forward some ideas associated with this political party, which, as I said, did amazing things from about 1967, 1968 through the early 80s. But I'm also thinking about some other images that maybe weren't so specific to places like Oakland or Detroit or Baltimore, where the Black Panthers had their party headquarters, but images that made their way into mass circulation. So I'm sorry for going quickly, and I'm just going to hold something up very fast. This is with Robert Redford on the cover, Life magazine from, let's see, February 6, 1970. You're all too young to remember Life magazine as this mass market periodical that told mostly white audiences what was going on in the world, chiefly by sending photographers like Gordon Parks, who took that image of Malcolm X I showed you a few moments ago, show people what's going on. And in this case, Parks went to Algeria, where Eldridge Cleaver and his wife, Kathleen, who I'm showing you here, were living in exile, having been accused of a crime. And Cleaver, rather than stand trial in his role as the Minister of Information for the Black Panther Party, chose to flee through Cuba to Algiers, where he was running the Black Panther Party movement in exile. And so I'm showing you both the photograph that got reproduced in that mass circulation magazine and the original negative or original print that Gordon Parks created in 1970, because I think the context in which these images are circulated is really important. How they're consumed, who would have seen this, what the message that they received was, even though today photographs like the one on the right have entered popular consciousness and are collected by institutions like USD as part of their permanent collections to teach this cultural moment. I'm also interested in it because images like Parks's are having a huge revival at the present time, and I'm interested in why that might be. So on the left, you may see Alicia Keys and her husband, Kazim Dean, on the cover of this recent magazine. I think this was published just a couple of years ago, but it's a work that depends so heavily, it seems to me, on a knowledge of the Parks photograph of Cleaver's on the right, that it almost ceases to be meaningful as an image without some understanding of where it comes from. That's not to say that I think everybody who picked up Cultured Magazine 2018 understood that this was an homage to Eldridge Cleaver and to Kathleen Cleaver, who was this remarkable, persuasive person. But I think without knowing that, you're really missing out on so much of the purchase of a work like this. So I'm trying in this recent work I'm doing to connect these contemporary representations to the historic ones that have had such an interesting history. And it's not just in magazine work. I would say that an artist like Rico Gatson, who's going to be showing some of his works at USD in the fall, takes a photograph like the one on the right of, again, Kathleen Cleaver and Bobby Seale, another member of the Black Panther Party, and he removes the background. He creates this Afrofuturist sunburst of color emanating from these forms and creates contemporary art from this historical image. And I want to know why in 2011, and Gatson is still making images like this today, why they're so compelling to us and why museums as well as collectors are interested in them. So I'm going to go pretty quickly. I'm showing you here two news photographs of Fred Hampton, who was the leader of the Black Panther Party, charismatic man, very important cultural figure in Chicago, who was also, you may know, assassinated by Chicago policemen. He was drugged and then his apartment was raided by police and he was brutally murdered. But these are the kinds of photographs of Hampton that circulated in the mass media right before his death, showing him as this incredibly hardworking, dedicated, as I said, almost spiritual leader of social change in the city of Chicago. It's interesting to me that, for instance, the one on the left, we don't even know who took that photograph, but it becomes a source for some representations, which I'm hoping at least a few of you will be familiar with. So if you saw the movie Judas and the Black Messiah, you know that Daniel Kaluuya's character is based on Fred Hampton, and the story it tells is of his rise to kind of political importance, and then what happens to him at the end is it culminates in his assassination. But that image, and which is based on the photographs that I've been showing you, is part of a large group of representations that have based themselves on this photographic documentation, and that would tell different stories, ranging from, you know, if you have ever seen on late night television Forrest Gump, you know that it has a section of it where the Black Panther Party makes a kind of cameo appearance, but the dress, the decorum, the kind of posing of the bodies is all based on this representational strategy that was affected in the 1960s, and actually, I would say, very self-consciously so. So again, I'm trying to figure out why these images have captivated us lately and what we can make of their authority today, based as they all are on a limited set of images that proliferated in the 1960s and early 1970s. So I'm showing you just another example of a work that I think is powerful and perplexing. On the right is a photograph by, again, an unknown press photographer who worked for the San Francisco Chronicle, or excuse me, the Examiner. And it shows Bobby Seale and Huey Newton in front of their party headquarters in Oakland, California. And then how quickly, almost immediately, the Black Panther Party co-opts this news image, which was meant to sort of suggest to the public in the Bay Area that this was a slightly defiant and even maybe dangerous group, but they take that image back and make it into this poster for their political effectiveness. And so these images, which are sort of early examples of appropriation on the part of these actors of the mass media, turning it to their own devices so that they could actually bring tremendous change. And I guess that's the piece that I want to make sure that we acknowledge as we do this really breakneck survey of this work. The Black Panther Party in 1966 defined itself through this 10-point program, which they actually revisited many times and refined in various ways. And if you read it quickly, and I'm sorry we have to do that right now, I mean, you'll notice, I think, right away in a stunning replay of history, how many of these issues that were identified in 1966 are still prevalent in our society, and how the sense of outrage that Newton and Seale articulated hasn't changed so much from the moment we're in now, where Black Lives Matter and other groups have voiced their legitimate protest against contemporary conditions. But this program actually provided the springboard for a lot of very powerful representations that took force, not just again in California, but throughout the country. And I'm just interested to share with you some less well-known images, but that I find also really interesting to consider, which show the kinds of social programs that the Black Panther Party was most invested in, not the images of them holding unconcealed weapons, but providing, for instance, free food for the community, providing breakfast for every school child in Oakland, California, who might otherwise go without breakfast before they attended school, providing clothing in New Haven, Connecticut, for families that otherwise might not have had new clothing to share. And then also the kind of protection, oftentimes from police, for neighborhoods that were under some kind of concern over whether they were getting the full protection of the law. And so these images, I think, circulate around that 10-point program, and they also are images that are slowly making their way into museum collections, which is sort of the other part of what Kate was talking about, you know, that people in museums, not maybe the memorial museums that she discussed, but people who work in museums, and I was a museum director for 15 years, make decisions about what comes into the permanent collections. These are the works today that I think are being considered, reconsidered, I should say, for those collections, and how they'll be interpreted by future scholars is really a matter that some of you may get to weigh in on. If you saw the film Judas and the Black Messiah, you know that there was this, from really the late 50s through the early 1970s, this the FBI ran a program called COINTELPRO, which was a kind of counterintelligence program where they infiltrated groups, not just the Black Panther Party, but many groups, with the intent to disrupt them, to sow dissent, to make people jealous and suspicious of each other. And they were, to a great extent, they were actually effective in doing some of that. And the imprisoned leadership of the Black Panther Party really was produced in some small part by the COINTELPRO groups. And so I'm showing you this other side group of images that I'm interested in, which are the political protest posters that were disseminated almost immediately upon the arrests and sometimes the trials of these political leaders. And I think that this work, as you can see, is made it into museum collections as kind of political graphics. And I'm interested to trace back one step further where those photographs that are the source images came from. This is Emory Douglas, who was the culture minister for the Black Panther Party, did these extraordinary works of graphic art that appeared originally in the Black Panther Party newspapers, which was a primary source of income for the group to sell these newspapers on the streets. And in them, you could have a poster produced by Emory Douglas, which you could put on your dorm room or in your bedroom, and sort of show sympathy with the causes. I'm interested that the people who produced the film Judas and the Black Messiah, they actually had the understanding to go back to Emory Douglas, who's still alive today, and ask him to make the movie poster that they used to market the film with Daniel Kaluuya, as you see here. And I'm interested again in the way in which those vocabularies of forms, these sort of bold images with text, get reused and recirculated in our own moment. And museums have been slow but surely taking up this call. So I just thought I would show you these two recent exhibitions of the works that Emory Douglas, but also other Black Panther affiliated artists produced. And at the Oakland Museum or the New Museum, you can actually see how this engaged activist protest work makes its way into the canon, not quite like Leonardo, but makes its way into the canon as something that we must consider historically in the future. And I think projects like these are really, really important for us to acknowledge, but also think critically about. And so I'm going to stop by just mentioning that I'm curating an exhibition with students in my Histories and Theories of Photography class this fall, which will actually explore these issues. So in our Humanities Center, when you go there, it's this beautiful little space. We're going to have an exhibition that considers the representations of the Black Panther, some of which I've shown you today, but also new work, like work by Sadie Barnett, who's not much older than most of you on this Zoom call, but whose father was a member of the Black Panther Party, and as part of the Freedom of Information Act, she's retrieved all the FBI files about her father's surveillance by the FBI in the late 1960s and early 1970s. And that has been the source of her work as a young artist, to sort of realize that in a time before she actually even knew her father, he was living this extraordinary, engaged political life set to bring about change. And that's what her work contends with today. So I hope you're gonna have lots of opportunities to do fun things on campus this fall, but I hope at some point you'll all make a stop in the gallery and see how some of this takes form and how it gets interpreted by some of your peers.
So I'm going to go way back, right? So we kind of come back to the 90s, back to the 2000s, back to the 1960s, back to Leonardo. I'm going to go to the ancients. Okay, I'm going to go to Plato and Aristotle. And I want to speak about some things that we can learn from the ancients about what I'm going to call political sustainability. Okay, so let me see if I can actually share my screen here. Yes, the joys of figuring this out. Okay, can everybody see that? Okay. So what can the ancient philosophers like Plato and Aristotle teach us about political sustainability? Okay, so political sustainability might sound a little bit obscure. We talk a lot about sustainability with regard to something like the environment, perhaps when it comes to things like our financial institutions, right? Our financial practices and so forth. But political sustainability has to do with the viability and stability of our political institutions, our political culture, I'm going to say, right? And our political practices. Now, of course, environmental sustainability, financial stability, political stability, they're all connected. When you have a financial crisis, you need the political system to respond. When the environment is threatened, you need to have a political solution and so forth. Okay, but what about when you have a political crisis? Who responds when your political institutions are under strain? And what form are those responses supposed to take? Okay, now those are, right, questions that many people are asking at the moment, now in 2021, because it does seem to many people that the sustainability of our political institutions is not as certain as perhaps it once seemed. Okay, so just like last year in 2020, a public intellectual by the name of Yuval Levin published a book called A Time to Build. And the basic premise of his book is that a lot of our foundational formative institutions seem to be failing. At least they're under tremendous strain such that we're losing trust in them. Right? Trust has been a theme that's come up again and again in this course. So institutions like our universities, right? That's something we could talk about for a long time. Our healthcare systems, our churches, and of course, our political institutions, particularly our Congress, which many people have characterized as, utterly dysfunctional. And there's another thinker by the name of Ross Douthat, who writes a column for the New York Times. And he's argued that we seem to be living in an age of decadence, where we have spent all of our political goodwill towards one another, so that there's very little of it left to go around. And this lack of goodwill, this lack of patience is leading to a lack of stability in our political institutions. Okay, so where do Plato and Aristotle fit into all of this? Well, these ideas of political stability, of political sustainability, they happen to be some of the very things that occupied the ancient philosophers, and indeed philosophers throughout the ages. So St. Augustine, Thomas Aquinas, Machiavelli, Thomas Hobbes, Rousseau, Tocqueville, Hannah Arendt, and so forth. Okay. And this is because these philosophers could all see politics is actually an inherently unstable activity. And I won't talk too much about that concept, but the basic idea is that as human beings, we're all social beings, but we're also competitive and power. And so politics becomes this place where somehow try to contain that power seeking, okay, so that human beings can flourish in their social relationships rather than be oppressed by them. But that containment of power seeking is a constant battle. It's a constant process. And that's why it continues to occupy the minds of philosophers. So back to the ancients, if politics is this inherently unstable activity, how do we make it stable and sustainable? So for Plato, especially, okay, I'm going to focus on him first. Your readings were about Aristotle. I'm going to focus on Plato because he's the OG. Okay, well, actually Socrates is the OG, but you know, okay. So for him, justice is fundamental to the idea of political sustainability. But what Plato means by justice is probably a little different from how we tend to think of it today. So let me just say a few words about what the ancients thought about justice. Now, in order to do that, I talk a little bit about Plato's method of doing philosophy. So here I have a slide, a bust of Socrates and a bust of Plato. So Socrates, as you can see from the dates, he's a generation older than Plato. Socrates is absolutely the inspiration for Plato's philosophy. Socrates himself wrote nothing. So everything we know about Socrates, we know from Plato, okay? So we know that Socrates had a very distinctive way of practicing philosophy, and that was to engage in a particular kind of conversation with someone, in which Socrates would profess ignorance to try to get people to reason and think about morality. And so Plato basically reconstructs these conversations Socrates had with people in ancient Athens, okay? And so Plato writes in dialogue form, which is why we refer to Plato's works as the Platonic dialogues. So what happens in the Platonic dialogues is that Socrates approaches a person who's sort of known in the community, someone who has a particular kind of reputation, okay? Usually a reputation for being knowledgeable on a particular subject. Usually a moral quality like courage or love or justice is going to be, right? That's going to come in beauty, right? So someone who's supposed to know about this particular thing. And then Socrates begins to ask them questions about what they know. But this method of asking questions actually ends up showing that the person who's answering the questions is really quite confused about a particular subject. So for instance, in a dialogue called the Euthyphro, Socrates asks a young man named Euthyphro, okay, the dialogue's named after the person, to tell him what piety is. Okay, piety is another word for holiness, righteousness as well. You might be able to use that word, but maybe stick with holiness for our culture. Okay, and Euthyphro confidently gives him a definition, but then through follow-up questions, Socrates is able to show that the first definition can't be right. Then Euthyphro tries again. Socrates asks more follow-up questions, showing again that the second definition can't be right either. Okay. And so this method is called the elenchus. This very simple definition, the Socratic method of eliciting truth by question and answer, especially as used to refute an argument. Okay, so notice here in this definition, Socrates is getting to the truth of something by asking questions. So the Socratic method is not where Socrates is giving you an answer. Okay, it's a method that makes you aware of your lack of knowledge. And this process is also referred to as the dialectic. I'm teaching ancient philosophy this term, so I'm super excited about this stuff. Okay. So now that I've talked a little bit about the Socratic method, let me return to Plato's notion of justice. Okay. So just like the various Platonic dialogues ask questions, okay, what is love? What is holiness? What is beauty? What is courage? And so forth. Plato's most famous work, which is called the Republic, right? He asks the question, what is justice? Okay. And indeed, that's how it opens the work within book one. Okay, it's got 10 books. Book one, what is justice? So in book one, Socrates has a conversation about justice with a few other Athenians. They debate whether justice is ignorance and wickedness, or is it wisdom and goodness? They ask whether injustice could be more profitable than justice, and so forth. It's a fairly normal Socratic discussion. But then in book two of the Republic, Socrates shifts the conversation, okay, and he asks instead, why should I be just? Okay. So now with this change in question, we've shifted the conversation from what is justice or what is the just state to an individual level. What does it mean for me to be a just person? Okay. So we're shifting our focus to what we could call the virtues. So I think we could understand a virtue to be something like a positive character trait in an individual person. All right. And we could juxtapose virtues to vices, which would be negative character traits. And, you know, again, I could talk about this for a whole semester about which things you're going to put on which ledger. Okay, but we're trying to give these basic definitions. Okay. Now, if you're an ancient Greek, okay, the ancient Greek word for virtue is arete. And that's actually better translated in English as excellence. So if you're an ancient Greek and someone's talking to you about virtue, you're really thinking, oh, he's got she's got the excellence of courage, or she's got the excellence of wisdom, or she's got the excellence of justice. Okay. So on this ancient view, of this Platonic view, excellence is a virtue is an excellence of the soul. It's something that your soul does well. So if you have the virtue of courage, you are excellent at being courageous. It's a characteristic that you have. It's something you do well. Now, notice too in our conversation, justice is being defined as a virtue. So if you're a just person, you have the virtue of justice. This means that ideally, you know how to act justly in whatever situation you find yourself. Okay, but just because Plato starts talking about justice as an individual virtue does not mean that he leaves behind the idea of the just state, okay, or a just political system. Far from it. Instead, what he does is he makes an analogy between the just person and the just state. So he thinks that in order to understand the one, you have to understand the other. Okay, so the just person and the just system are connected. And not only are they connected, but Plato goes further and he's like, actually, I don't think you can have one without the other. So in order to have a just state, you'd need to have just citizens. But in order to have just citizens, you'd have to be raised in a just system. And the inverse is also helpful to articulate, which is if people are raised in an unjust system, then Plato thinks that they almost certainly will be unjust people. So this is one of the main themes in the Republic, which comes first, the just person or the just system. Okay, now be all that as it may, we can take a step back a bit, okay, and realize that with these themes on the table, Plato is thinking about sustainability. He's asking, how are we going to produce and sustain this just system? He's also asking, exactly how are we going to get there? Because there's a certain kind of person that's going to enable this sustainability, and that is the just person. Okay, so it does seem like it's important for us to talk about what it means to be a just person. So in order to talk about the virtue of justice, we have to talk just a little bit about the theory of the soul for the ancients. Okay, you just have to go with this. I tell my students, if you don't believe in the soul, that's fine, pretend, okay? So you have to understand where they're coming from, okay? So the soul is basically for the ancients what keeps a body alive. But the soul has got a structure to it. And for human beings, ancients think that human beings have three parts to their souls. Okay, so Plato thinks that the human soul has the spirited, the bottom here, right? So The appetites, the desires, that part of the soul, also referred to as the passions. There's the spirited part of the soul, which I'm not going to talk too much about right now. That doesn't really matter for what we're doing. And then the rational part of the soul. Okay. So this is this tri-part theory of the soul. So starting first with the soul's desires, appetites, and passions, number 3. Now, the more you do philosophy, the more you understand just what the ancients are talking about here. But for now, okay, it's going to refer to something like your physical appetites, for sure. That's going to be in there. So your appetites for food, drink, your need for sex, sleep, like these kinds of physical needs that we have that can turn into desires that we might overstep. Okay. You could also put like maybe our instincts can come in here too. And also for our purpose today, we can put in some slightly higher order passions, like our desire for power. Also, kind of anger can go in here too, kind of the capacity that we have to get angry, sometimes irrationally. Okay. So Plato calls all of these appetites irrational. Okay, so this is the irrational part of the soul. But notice here, we also have the rational part of the soul. So when we talk about virtue and developing virtue, we're interested in this relationship between the passions or the irrational part of the soul on the one hand and the reason or the rational part of the soul on the other. So the role of reason is to guide our desires, to guide our passions in appropriate ways. So for the ancients, the desires and the passions, they're understood as pertaining to just what's happening here in the moment. So they're kind of brutish in that way. There's no broader picture or larger context in which the passions know how to operate. That's not what they do. They don't have the ability to think about the longer term or a larger value system. Okay, so reason is the ability, right, or the capacity in this Platonic tradition. That's the thing that can take the longer view and channel our desires and passions appropriately. So for Plato, reason has to be the ruler of the soul in the sense that it has to guide and direct the irrational part of our soul, which is our passions or desires. Okay. So the well-ordered soul for Plato is when reason rules over the passions, but in the disordered soul, passion rules over the reason. Okay, so just because reason is designed to be the ruler of the soul doesn't mean that it's going to be. No. Okay, that's the purpose of education, but I'll talk about that in another time. Okay, so as human beings, we have to learn how to subdue our passions so that they're under command of the reason. If you learn how to do that, then you have a well-ordered soul, which is the just soul. If you don't know how to do that, you have the disordered soul, which ends up being the unjust soul. So if we turn to the idea of virtue, it turns out that all of the virtues, courage, self-control, wisdom, patience, mercy, generosity, good judgment, and of course the virtue of justice, which we're talking about, they all stem in some way from this ability to tame the passions and subject them to the governance of reason. So with this idea of controlling and guiding the passions, the virtuous soul, we've really hit upon one of the major themes in ancient philosophy. Okay, the idea of the virtuous life is also the good life. Okay, these are always asking this question: what is the good life? And for our purposes here, I think we could also say that for the ancients, the good life, which is the virtuous life, is also the sustainable life. So if we're always letting our passions get in the way, right? If we make a habit of giving into our greed or our anger, or if we're never patient with people, or we never forgive people, if we're never generous with people by giving them the benefit of the doubt, if we let ourselves be blinded by our own selfishness instead of thinking about how our actions affect other people, then I hope you could see that this would lead to eventually an unsustainable way of living. Okay, and the reason why I think, is because it wouldn't allow us to flourish in our relationships with other people. Okay. Now, this links in with the reading that I had to do on Aristotle. I'm going to talk later. Okay, But the essence of those assigned readings is about all those views, the proper training of our passions and the reorientation of our desires is what's necessary to build a sustainable life for ourselves, but also to build a truly sustainable political system. Okay, so for both Plato and Aristotle, there's this crucial connection between the person who lives in these sustainable ways in their individual life and the sustainable political system. Okay, so in other words, there is that crucial connection between the just person and the just state. Now, if you go back to the present, okay, back to our story of now, maybe we think, okay, there's no lessons for me here. Okay, move along, right? No lessons for the agents. Our political systems are too big. Our tech systems are too big. And we as individuals just don't matter in those systems. It doesn't matter if we ourselves are just, our individual virtue just doesn't have any impact on these systems. Or you could flip it, right? And you could say, no, through organized activism, we can make our systems just, but we ourselves don't have to have the virtue of justice in order to do that. Okay. And what I think I would say to that is that both of those points of view seem to deny the dignity of the individual. And again, this is where the ancients can help us. So both Plato and Aristotle stress the flourishing life of the individual, and then they build their political ideas off of that. So for them, the less a political regime cares about the flourishing of its citizens, then the less sustainable it's going to be. Okay, but it's actually more than that. For Plato especially, it's the individual who must be seeking to understand justice, asking questions about what justice is, practicing the dialectic, which we talked about earlier, where the individual becomes aware of what they don't know about justice. But this process of questioning and searching for an understanding of justice is actually an integral part of the virtuous life, which I've also been talking about today. This is because for Plato, to engage in the rational activity of understanding justice is to gain a knowledge which actually changes you. Okay, and this is going back to the Leonardo presentation, right? This idea that knowledge and love are totally connected. So if you gain a knowledge of something good, something like justice, it changes you in the sense that it changes your desires, it changes what you want, it reorients you. So to know what justice is, according to Plato, is to also want to just. You can't, if you don't want to be just, then you don't know what justice is. That's what a Platonist would say. Okay. So for Plato, true knowledge is transformative. It transforms the inner person and it makes them good. It makes them virtuous. So if you have no one doing this, if no one is confronting their own ignorance and searching to understand justice, and therefore searching also to be just, then you can't have a just society. And ultimately you have no political sustainability. Okay. And so in the end, I think what we can learn from the ancients is that our individual virtue matters, our individual knowledge matters, and our individual justice matters. Okay. And a political system is only sustainable as the ways of life of its people. But as we say in philosophy, you're welcome to disagree.
Thank you all so much. To borrow Dr. Asaro's words from earlier, my wheels are turning and I have lots of thoughts and questions. And we will open up now to some student questions that we got a lot of excellent ones in our chat. And we will start with Dr. DeConinck, and this question talks a lot about how there are selections of artifacts because there's so many, and how that impacts the story that's told in the museum. And then the student was wondering, does this mean that museums are biased, even though we're not thinking of them as biased? Having a small group of people choosing these items, can that make it create a subconscious bias? How can this impact collectively and individually our thoughts on museums and past events? And I I think this connects quite a bit with Dr. Cartwright as well, and a lot of the thoughts he was saying. So I'll pass it over.
And I love that this question is also getting to the heart of questions about power and privilege, right? And thinking about, we trust our museums, but they're also not just these neutral tellings of history, right? There's no one story, there's no one site that can, fully encapsulate these complex historical moments, right? And yet many of us go to museums expecting that we're going to get the truth, right? I know that was certainly my experience of being a kid and going to different museums in Boston and other places growing up. So yeah, I think that, there is what the museum or memorial museums, what they do for us in the process of creating them, which is really what I was focused on in my lecture today, thinking about for a community that has been through a traumatic event, just the process of creating that museum can do something for them, right? But I do think this question is reminding us that while we shouldn't necessarily distrust museums, we should maybe pay more attention to who had a role in the creation of that space, which is why I like Edward Linenthal's work so much, because he says, here were the family members, here were the others. And then you start to think about, but where were these other people, right? And just to give you one example from my field work, I did a lot of work about 9/11 and the sites that kind of sprung up in Lower Manhattan. There's a lot of talk about kind of survivor stories, right, in these different spaces that I spent a lot of time at. But when you think about who do we even consider to be a survivor, or what artifacts are included or excluded, right? We're constantly drawing these boundaries of inclusion and exclusion, right? For example, a lot of people, when they think about 9/11, they don't think about the fact that Chinatown is located right next to Lower Manhattan and was, fully cut off from the rest of the city as a result of the towers coming down, huge economic and also just human impact of, on that community. But that's not one of the main narratives in the museum, right? When we think about who suffered or who's considered a survivor, right? I also do a lot of work on the issue of homelessness in the city of San Diego. And part of that sprung up because in my field work in New York City, I realized that when they even do, the death counts for how many people were killed on 9/11, that's not an exact number, because there were people who were unsheltered, who lived in that area, who also died, who are not counted in that number, right? So there are many ways we can think about the objects that are included or excluded. We can think about the voices or the stories that are included or excluded. But what I love, and I don't want this to feel hopeless, right? Because museums are valuable, right? And as we've seen in many different ways in the presentations today, having stories that we tell about the past is a valuable thing as we start to think about the moment we're living in. But what I appreciate is the work of a scholar named James Young, who says that our memorials and our museums are valuable as long as they are constantly being interrogated for these reasons, right? If we keep asking questions about the past, then our memorials, even if they're problematic in certain ways, are still useful to us because we're not just blindly accepting them, right? So he does a lot of work on Holocaust memorials and says, basically, the only bad memorial is the one that nobody talks about anymore, right? So I guess that would be maybe a partial answer to that question. But I would also, if Dr. Cartwright would like to chime in on that, I would love to hear his thoughts on this too.
Thanks. Well, I think what you said was really important. And I think we're living in a moment where we realize how things move from archives and museums into the public trust and to visibility is not a neutral thing. So I think you said that so well, Kate. And I'm interested in that. When I began my work in museums, it was commonplace, to have an object on a wall and then a text next to it, usually very short, telling you what it was you were looking at. That text was never signed. You never knew who produced it. It was just the omniscient voice of authority speaking to you, telling you what's important about this object. I think it's a good thing. It's gone to the side. And I think since you're from Boston, you should know that, places like the MFA did these great projects where they would invite 5 different people to write a comment about a particular work of art. And each one was distinct, right? So that idea that there is an authority that can be trusted, that is correct, and that is impartial was really thrown into question by the institutions themselves. And just to the students, I would say there's a great Instagram account called Change the Museum, which is basically museum professionals ratting out their institutions. So they say what's going on that's not okay, and they do it anonymously, and every day it's populated by people who sort of are mistrusting that idea that the institution should be, somehow beyond any kind of reproach. So I think it's interesting. I mean, I think it's problematic too, to be able to say whatever you want anonymously without being accountable. But it does tell you that institutions are thinking critically about their role and the stories that they tell. And so thanks for sharing that response with me.
Because the next question is for Dr. Asaro. And there were kind of two questions, and I will combine them just a little bit. One was some questions if Da Vinci talked about some of the thinkers or that influenced his work. And then also the other, and this question was really thinking about kind of a lineage of knowledge or lineage of thought. And it's really related to another question that is talking about how do we determine who is important, right? Or why are certain people not deemed as important in certain moments and then later they are, and or how many are these kind of hidden stories that we never actually hear about, but that's another topic.
These are actually two questions that I'm working on quite a bit right now, and I kind of give you a snapshot, but again, the story could continue. For the first, Leonardo doesn't really attribute his, the inspiration for his ideas to anyone. But I won't say too much more about that. Well, two things. First is that these notebooks were not intended for publication. So Leonardo was not really, as far as we know, was not really consciously thinking of his impact upon a potential audience, but it really was kind of the free musings of his mind. And the second thing that I'll say is something that you maybe picked up on in your readings, is that he denounces those who would look to the ancients for knowledge. And then he says, I could spit back to them the words of Marius in my defense. So he's ironically kind of doing the same thing. He's looking to the ancients in order to defend himself against those detractors who would say, he is not learned. So he obviously, and he's able to read and write, he obviously, there's some kind of, I would say, hidden privilege there. And on that note, I'll move into the other question quickly, is that absolutely, as although Leonardo did not have a a formal education, I think we can see evidence of the privileges that he had in order to be able to produce what he did. One of those, and perhaps, my personal life is coming into play here, but is the privilege of time. As a man and as someone who was employed, he had the privilege to write about, about reflections. And as a counterpoint, I'll just introduce you to another amazing literary artifact, which are the letters of a woman named Alessandra Strozzi, writing a little bit before Leonardo, but she was a patrician, upper class woman, not an aristocrat, an upper class, we can say, bourgeois woman. And she also has letters that were not intended for publication that she writes to her sons. And all of these letters are about how to get her sons married, to brides that are going to bring them wealth, because if they do not do this, then Alessandra, who is a widow, her fortune's going to pass out of the family hands. She talks about taking out insurance on her pregnant daughter in case her daughter dies in childbirth. And she says this, it could seem very callously, but I would argue that a woman living in this time period, she has to think differently because she does not have the time to think about the beauty of nature or to look at leaves and think about hair. She's got to get it done, and again, you might be picking up on that I'm speaking from my own reality, but I'm very personally very aware of this, and that perhaps there are things that would have been written by women, by those of lower classes, by those in marginalized groups. And by the way, I am having a guest speaker, the author of a book called The Black Middle Ages that I'm very excited about, and I don't have the details for you quite yet. I don't have a website, but somehow if you're interested, just email me and I'll give you it's going to be on Zoom in the semester. But perhaps there are things that would have been written by people in these groups if they had had the comfort and the time to write about them, and were not drawn by the necessities of life to think on other things.
Dr. Cartwright and Dr. Hamilton-Bleakley, just a little bit about the same kind of question. So Dr. Cartwright, you talked a lot about diversifying a collection, for example, and I was wondering if you could kind of demystify that just for a little bit with us of what that looks like and why that's necessary. And then from a philosophical perspective, I think there's a lot to be said of that too. So we'll go to Dr. Cartwright and then Dr. Hamilton-Bleakley, and then I'll go back to the questions we'd planned.
Just really quickly, I would say that, museums and their formation, it's not a neutral thing. At USD, for instance, we have a really fine print collection. It's mostly old master prints, mostly works by male artists. When I arrived, there were 2 works by female artists and no works by any artists of color. So I got here having worked in large museums and other places and thought, this is crazy, and you can't teach in a university context and only show Angelica Kaufman and Keta Kollwitz to students as the sum total of women's contributions to the history of art. So it takes almost an activist perspective to say, we are going to take the limited resources that we have. And at USD, it basically is me going out and asking people to give us money so that I can buy works of art to broaden the collection. And now as a result, we have hundreds of works by women artists and maybe about 50 works by African-American artists and similar numbers by Latinx artists. But it's a good thing that you said. It's something that needs to be demystified. We shouldn't think that museums open the doors and they've automatically got these diverse collections to share that tell the story of human progress. It's not the case, and it takes some effort. So we're working at it. We're nowhere close to where I would like us to be in terms of our stature as a collecting institution, but give us some time, and maybe in your lifetimes, not mine, it will be possible to claim some victories there.
Dr. Hamilton-Bleakley.
Yeah, so are you asking about diversifying the canon, or what?
Those questions are kind of about what is deemed important, what are the things that we kind of ignore, or as time evolves, we have different foci who change over time.
Well, I guess I could speak to it as a historian of philosophy, meaning how have we done philosophy in the past, right? Which has to do with who's at our universities, which has to do with what families do they come from, which has to do with, do you see what I mean? Which has to do with which countries they're in, which has to do, the whole thing is just wrapped up. I'm not saying, I love philosophy, and I'm not saying philosophy is, I do think it has a more kind of, I don't know how to say this. That I think Socrates can be a figure of inspiration for anyone. Speaking from personal experience again, I did my PhD when I had 2 babies during my PhD. And I actually found a lot of comfort in philosophy. I found a lot of comfort in what I was reading. So I think philosophy can speak to anyone, but at the same time, I think that what we need to, when we read philosophy, we need to come to it understanding what is the context. Who are these people? Why were they talking about these things? And what opportunities did they have that allowed them to talk about these things that other people who didn't have those opportunities were not in the room? If that makes sense. I think that's the best way forward. So then you read people like Mary Wollstonecraft, you read people like Hannah Arendt, women who loved philosophy, but who also understood that there's things we need to change in order to get other people in the room to have those discussions.
So this is a question for Dr. Cartwright, and the student question was, do you think that images, especially considering which images were taken and kind of circulated and which were not, and those images that are conserved and taken care of can affect our memory, or our current reality, especially with regards to underrepresented groups?
Yes, that's the answer. But I think it's obviously a complicated question. I think that, I talk about this with my students in this Histories and Theories of Photography course. We're living in a time where we're all photographers. Some of you have already taken photographs today, and your phones are just full of images that you haven't yet deleted. That is not the case for 1966, where people loaded film into a camera by hand. They had 36 exposures if they were lucky. They shot those, and then if they worked for a newspaper organization, they sent them off to be published, or if they were fine artists, they printed them themselves. There's a limited archive that constructs our vision of history. It's why I think it's so important to interrogate these images and to think which images survive. How did they survive? Because UC Santa Cruz has this amazing archive of Black Panther Party material. They have this incredible, as yet uninvestigated archive of powerful visual imagery, which actually might reinterpret how we understand that historical moment when scholars get to it. That's why I'm excited about it. I'm sort of worried. Susan Sontag, who's a great literary theorist, talked about the ecology of images and how polluted the image world has become. And by that, I think she meant you have to sort through all this imagery. No other point in history has the image world been as polluted as it is today. So I think we've got to spend some time thinking about what images compel, which images don't, which we're going to use to tell history, and which are ultimately discardable.
And then our last question is for Dr. Hamilton-Bleakley, and it's asking about, is it even attainable to have a society that's only run by people who are doing it justly? Like, would this be a utopia, or would this be an impossible ideal society? And I also have to say, all of these questions in this discussion reminds me why every week I come out of this class and I say, this was my favorite session. So I'll pass it over to Dr. Hamilton-Bleakley.
Yes, indeed. So Plato's Republic is a utopia, and that's the criticism of actually Plato's Republic is why I went to graduate school, because I was both fascinated and repulsed by what Plato was offering. So yes, the criticism throughout the ages is that this is a utopia that probably, that we know can't really be attained given human nature and the way that it is. That doesn't mean that it's not basically one of the greatest works in political philosophy ever, right? So what it does is it shows you the essential connection between individual virtues and a larger political system. And we need to work out which parts we can do and which parts are impossible, right? It's up to us to figure out what are the lessons we need to take from this. So any great, work of literature or work of philosophy is to both challenge you, and it's also going to, you're going to have to extract the parts from it that you need, right? That you find most useful. So yeah, I mean, obviously there is this kind of cycle. He sort of sets up this idea that, without a just system, you can't have just people, and with people, you can't have a just system. But his solution then is, and students never like this when I say this, but his solution is philosophy, right? His solution is, we have to get a group of people and we have to make them philosophers. And we have to raise them, just in this kind of dialectical, philosophical environment. And then they'll be the leaders, right? And then they'll create the just state. But then the irony is they end up screwing it up as well. So, but maybe I shouldn't have told you that.
Oh, there are many lessons from sci-fi literatures and narratives in there as well that we don't have time to talk about. Thank you all professors for these stimulating conversations. Thank you all students for your fascinating conversations and questions.